Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes started life as a short story, first published in 1959, and was later expanded into a novel in 1966. It tells the story of Charlie Gordon, a man with a 68 IQ due to severe learning difficulties, who selected to undergo an experimental operation to increase human intelligence. The operation has been carried out seemingly successfully on a laboratory mouse named Algernon. And Algernon kind of acts as a bit of a canary in the coal mine throughout the course of the story as for what Charlie kind of has coming up. So we see the story told from Charlie's point of view. He's writing these progress reports that chronicle his experience through the whole process. So they're all first person, and you can see as his intelligence increases, so too does his ability to use proper grammar, his spelling improves, all of this sort of stuff. And you're seeing this happen throughout the novel. It's a nice touch that does make Charlie feel more like a real person. So I finished this book about a week ago and have been struggling since to really kind of gather my thoughts on actually what my position is. I had so many mixed feelings about this book. It really felt like there was a lot of stuff in there that I really loved. And then it was almost like there were kind of two works going on, like one that I really connected with and really enjoyed, and then another one which I didn't so much. And so yesterday, out of curiosity as much as anything, I'd only read the novel. And yesterday I read the original short story from 1959. And things started to drop into place a little bit. So the novel is considered a sci-fi classic, and many people consider it to be a masterpiece of the genre. I am not one of them. I do, however, think that the short story is a wonderful piece of short science fiction. So as with a lot of science fiction, Flowers for Algernon is concerned with ideas and moral quandaries explored through the framing of a science fiction plot. In particular, here Keyes is looking at the treatment of those with disabilities, the link between intelligence and morality. He looks at what it means to label a person. He is given this label of being someone with psychiatric disabilities, and then even when his intelligence increases after his surgery, he still isn't treated like everybody else. As I say, the short story is really excellent. It's not very long. I'll put a link to it in the description. There's a place you can read it on a PDF. And it really does sort of get in, formalize an idea. It raises questions without feeling the need to purport to know any of the answers to those questions. And it leaves you on a heartbreaking note. It is powerful and touching and heartbreaking, and it does everything that it needs to do. Sadly, the work has not sustained the transition to a novel particularly well. I don't really see anything that is added to the novel that needs to be there or improves the work as a whole. So most of the short story is essentially left intact and forms the beginning and end of the novel. Most of the additions in the full-length version are just in the middle. And so where the short story is predominantly made up of Charlie's progress reports as he, from before the operation, through the operation, and then through his rapid incline, there's then a gap that kind of gets missed where we assume he has been taking on extreme amounts of knowledge and has been living as a genius essentially for a few weeks. And then the progress reports, we start to track his decline as the effects are only temporary. Most of the editions of the novel come in that middle section, bridging the gap between that incline and decline. It turns what is a touching and good-natured and powerful piece of short fiction into something altogether a bit more cynical. It introduces a few more problems. I think Keyes tries to maybe feed us some answers which aren't wholly satisfying. And in the time that gets added, we see that Charlie turns from being a sweet-natured and good, compassionate person before the operation to his intelligence kind of corrupting him into this superior, arrogant, just awful person to be around. And you have quite mixed feelings about it as it goes through, because you start to realize that actually what Keyes is doing is he wants you to dislike Charlie. He knows what he's doing, and to some extent Charlie does as well. He says towards the end of the book that human intelligence without being tempered by affection isn't worth a damn. We understand through flashbacks in the novel that are kind of peppered throughout, these like hallucinatory flashbacks, that Charlie suffered abuse and trauma as a child because his parents, and specifically his mother, which is a problem we'll get onto in a moment, didn't understand his condition and didn't treat him very well. And that is one addition that I will say has a positive side, is that these flashbacks, you do start to understand Charlie more as a person. You do start to get an idea of where this man comes from and really who he is. And you can sympathize to some extent with his more problematic character traits, because you can see that they are a result of abuse, basically. But so much of what gets added to the novel just seems to detract from what was an interesting and well-examined piece of short fiction. And it's such a shame. We spend so much time hearing about how Charlie feels isolated due to his increased intelligence, and it kind of echoes the feeling of isolation he had due to his decreased intelligence, where he didn't feel as though he could fit in. He didn't feel as though he was like other people, and he wanted to be. He keeps talking about how he wants to be smart. He doesn't want to be dumb anymore, in his words. Finally, he gets that, but he surpasses everybody, and then he starts to feel isolation at the top. Now, this is a facet of the short story, but in the amount of time that we then spend with Charlie in the novel version, it just gets to be so tiring. And I couldn't help but feel, while I was reading it, that it was coming from Keyes himself. And I know it's not right to conflate writer and character, but there was a quote I saw from a memoir that Daniel Keyes wrote, in which talking about the idea for the novel, he said something about how he felt like his education was driving a wedge between him and the people he loved. And yeah, that's a bit of a yikes for me. This idea that you're just too smart, you couldn't possibly concern yourself or make emotional connections with other people, doesn't really ring true to me. And what bit of that we get in the short story kind of feels to me more like people still won't accept Charlie because he's still different in some way, and they also struggle to change their preconceptions about him before the surgery. That idea gets buried beneath so much more explication in the novel about how the reason he can't get on board with anybody, the reason he can't form emotional connections, is because of his increased intelligence. And there's no idea that his emotional development is still stunted and left behind even as his intellect rapidly improves, which I sort of felt a little bit uneasy about. It seemed to be kind of suggesting to me that people with psychiatric disabilities can't form complex and emotional bonds with the people around them, which, as far as I'm aware, just isn't true. I don't see any reason why his increased capacity for intelligence should mean that he can suddenly access repressed memories. That doesn't seem to be any link there. To me, if you repress memories, it's not because you're not smart enough to remember what happened. It's because your brain is protecting yourself from emotional trauma. If he's not any more emotionally developed than he was before the operation, why would he now be able to access all of his old memories? And so while the memories themselves perhaps ground Charlie and give him more kind of a third dimension, the very idea that he's actually accessing them doesn't seem, and that isn't a facet of the short story. And that seems like something that was put in my opinion, perhaps misguidedly. And through those memories, we get to one of my major gripes with the novel, and it is the treatment of the novel's female characters. So even in the short story, we are given this kind of throwaway line about one of the researchers' wives who's, a nagging wife who's just pushing her husband to succeed and that kind of thing. And it's an eye-rolly sentence, but it is basically just that. It is an eye-rolly sentence and you can move on. The novel puts a lot more emphasis on the female characters that it does have, and yet none of them are written well at all. They are all just two-dimensional stereotypes that either serve Charlie's character development or the plot development, and very rarely are they treated with any kind of compassion. Charlie treats all the people around him horrendously, and while the novel does, towards the end, push forward this message of intellect not being worth anything without affection, or kind of searching for knowledge while pushing those around you aside isn't worth anything. And one of the characters even tells Charlie that he turned from being a good-natured, likable young man into an arrogant, antisocial, self-centered bastard. And that is all true, but it never really feels as though the things that Charlie is being chastised for in his personality is to do with how he treats the women in his life. It's like more the fact that he's just kind of arrogant and looks down on everybody, and because he's so much smarter than they all are. And there never seems to be any indication that anyone around him, or even perhaps Keyes himself, thinks that the way Charlie treats women in his life, there's a problem with. The women in the book are almost always the source of the problems. I mentioned that there's a researcher's wife who the reason he wants to rush through his research and maybe isn't giving it the time it deserves is because she is pushing him to be famous, because all she cares about is having a famous husband. And then there's Charlie's mother. We see a lot of Charlie's mother through the flashbacks which have been added to the novel. And while Charlie's father is a very rational person who wants to get him the help he needs and understands that he's not like the other children and he needs certain patience, Charlie's mother's not like that. She essentially just abuses him. She just constantly wants him to be normal, to be like everybody else. There seems to be the insinuation that the reason she's upset about it isn't because of Charlie's condition, but it's because she's worried about how it's going to look socially. I do understand that wrapped up in that, there is comment on how we treat those people with disabilities. And I think that is an important thing to explore. And I do think that you're encouraged as you read to think about how you yourself treat those people that have disabilities or that are less intelligent than yourself. But it doesn't necessarily have to be presented in such a way that makes it out that all the female characters always seem to just be either shallow or superficial or the root of a problem. The only female character in the story that provides a solution to a problem provides that solution by basically being a body for Charlie to have sex with to get over some of his emotional hang-ups. Yeah. Ultimately, there is still good in the novel. It is based on good source material, and the short story does explore some really decent ideas in a sensitive and powerful way. In expanding it to the novel, though, there's very, very little that gets added, which actually improves the work at all. The beginning and the ending, as I say, are basically left intact, and essentially the short story provides the kind of trappings for the middle of the novel. And those moments are still well delivered. They're still emotionally impactful. Seeing Charlie start as a man with disability, and he's just so kind-natured, but he doesn't understand that the people that are laughing at him. He thinks they're his friends. And of course, that kind of illusion gets shattered later on. It kind of brings up this question of whether it was even right to do it in the first place. That kind of Jurassic Park idea of being so concerned with whether you could that you don't stop to think whether you should. Does it really matter if it was a lie, if it made Charlie happy? In fact, I would say that one of the kind of overarching themes that the novel has is that it isn't the answer. Just being smarter doesn't mean anything. And we can't judge somebody's worth based on their intelligence, because even when he's intelligent, he still feels just as isolated, just as cast out, just as unaccepted as he did before the surgery. But despite all that, of course, he is upset to lose his intelligence. He doesn't want to revert back to being the person he was before, who wasn't able to understand kind of basic concepts, couldn't read and write properly. And as it becomes clear that he is going to revert back, that he is going to decline back to his previous capacity, there's real tragedy to it, especially in the short story where you haven't had all of this time to grow to hate Charlie. It kind of undermines its own message. Charlie turns into such an awful person. He's racked with depression. He feels as though he can't fit in the world properly. It doesn't seem to solve any of his problems. And so you can't help but sort of think, well, he was happier he was happier before. He was nicer before. He was a more compassionate person before. So doesn't actually really feel like all that bad of an outcome. But in the short story, you really feel the tragedy. You feel him desperately clinging on to the intelligence that he has, scared to go back into that place that he once was. And for me, that is just so much more effective at what it is trying to do. I understand there's going to be people that are going to say it's a product of its time and you can't necessarily hold it to standards that you have now. But as a friend of mine pointed out when I was talking with her about the book, Thomas Hardy was writing better female characters a good 80 years before this. So I don't really accept that as much of an excuse. I will say that some of the ways in which those people with psychiatric disabilities are spoken about and written about in this book doesn't conform with today's standards. Some of the understanding of psychiatric analysis and care just doesn't, there's a huge reliance that Charlie has on like sleep learning, which is just something I'm pretty sure we've proven doesn't really work now, but they were so convinced that it worked at the time, and that makes its way in there. But that is all based on scientific understanding. And, even the language that gets used, Charlie goes to a school for retarded adults. I mean, that's just not an acceptable way to refer to the people now, but you can understand that at the time, the contemporaneous understanding of people with disabilities, it seems like it was probably pretty accurate and in a lot of ways probably quite fair. Like I say, one of the really grounding themes of the novel is that these are human beings and we can't treat them differently. We should treat them with the respect they deserve. And so I don't think those things are problematic or offensive in the same way that I do with the treatment of women, which I do find to be pretty unacceptable and pretty much irreconcilable as far as I'm concerned. Ultimately, there is a fair amount of rich thematic content in Flowers for Algernon, both the short story and the novel. It's just a great premise as well. I mean, it's one of those premises that's so good that you kind of are shocked it took until 1960 or whatever it was for it to actually be written. The short story proves to be a competent, powerful exploration of that premise. I don't think the novel manages to sustain that. The only truly successful things explored in the novel are essentially just retreads of what was done in the short story, and almost everything that gets added brings with it its own problems. Yeah, it's led to this really mixed feeling that I have on the novel, and I think what it is that there is a great story in there, and it is surrounded by a bunch of stuff that I don't really like. So I suppose my review is read the short story. It's much better. This one's probably going to piss a lot of people off, isn't it? Press the buttons, please. You can press the dislike. Thanks for watching. Put your thoughts down below. I assume there's going to be a fair amount of disagreement with me on this one. I know this book is really well loved, and unfortunately it didn't quite... I think maybe I've come across a little bit more harshly than I wanted to, and I think a lot of that is just now having read the short story, the issues that I have with the novel are just so much more disappointing than had I just left it as it was and kind of had these mixed feelings about it. Either way, it has been something that I've been thinking about a lot all week since I sort of finished it a week or so ago. I suppose that is at least one thing you could give it. So yeah, let me know what you thought below, and I'll be responding to comments, and also press all the buttons. Press them. And I'll see you again. Bye.